Jake had worked the night shift at the warehouse for almost 5 years. The hours passed in eerie silence, broken only by the occasional hum of forklifts or distant clangs from metal racks shifting under the weight of products. The lights flickered sporadically, casting long, distorted shadows across the vast expanse of the building. It was a quiet routine he had grown accustomed to. But this night, as he moved through the familiar rows of towering shelves, his instincts sharpened. As Jake worked his way toward the back of the warehouse, where the light was weakest, he thought he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. A figure, dark and tall, seemed to be lingering just beyond his vision. He stopped, squinting into the dim recesses between the shelves, expecting to see one of his co-workers. But the space was empty. He brushed it off as a trick of the light. Shadows played strange games in the cavernous warehouse, and he had learned long ago not to let them get to him. Still, as he continued sorting through boxes, the unsettling sensation persisted. His skin prickled, and a sense of unease crept in, causing him to glance over his shoulder more often than usual. Minutes later, while shifting a crate, he saw it again, the same tall figure standing completely still at the far end of the aisle. This time, it wasn't a fleeting glimpse. It stood there, unmoving. Jake blinked, trying to adjust his eyes to the dim light. The figure did not move, its silhouette stark against the backdrop of shelving units. A figure, just standing there, watching. Jake's heartbeat quickened. He called out, but his voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the warehouse. No response. He began walking toward the figure, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the quiet space. But as he drew closer, the figure seemed to melt into the shadows, dissolving into the dimness before disappearing entirely. He halted. His breaths came quicker now, shallow and strained. The spot where the figure had been was empty, just rows of boxes and equipment stacked as usual. He scanned the area, his eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The quiet returned, heavy and unsettling. He felt an inexplicable chill run through him. Jake shook his head, trying to shake off the sense of dread creeping up his spine. Returning to his task, he tried to refocus, but his concentration faltered. The vastness of the warehouse, usually so routine, now seemed more expansive, more isolated. The rhythmic clinking and creaking of the old building only added to the growing tension. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. As he rounded another corner, heading toward the back offices to log his progress, his eye caught movement once more. The figure now closer, standing in the aisle directly ahead of him. He froze, every muscle tensing. This time it was unmistakable. It was no shadow, no flicker of light. The figure stood tall, its outline sharper, more defined. It wasn't just standing in the shadows, it seemed to emerge from them, a part of the darkness itself. Jake felt his pulse pounding in his ears as he slowly backed away, unwilling to take his eyes off the figure. He expected it to move, but it remained still, almost as though waiting for something. The warehouse, once a familiar place of work, now felt labyrinthine, each aisle stretching longer and more claustrophobic than the last. Unable to turn his back on the figure, Jake retraced his steps, edging away from it. But with each backward step, the shadows around him seemed to deepen, narrowing the space between them. The figure remained fixed in place, yet it somehow felt as though its presence was spreading, filling the corners of his vision, watching him from every angle. He reached the entrance to the old storage section, a place that hadn't been used in years. The doorway stood half open, revealing a staircase leading down into the darkness. A gust of cold air drifted up from below, sending shivers through him. The figure was still there, lingering, its silhouette barely visible now, blending into the dim light. Jake stood frozen, torn between going down the stairs or staying where he was, knowing that either direction held an unknown that he couldn't rationalize. The darkness seemed to close in on him as the warehouse's familiar structure twisted into something unknown and menacing. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, trapped in indecision, but the figure never moved, never approached. The door to the stairwell creaked as it swung further open. Behind him, the lights flickered, casting strange, erratic shadows on the walls. He took a step back, then another, forcing himself to turn toward the lit part of the warehouse. As he hurried away, he couldn't help but glance back once more. The figure was gone. Marissa sat alone in the dispatcher's office. the soft glow from the multiple screens reflecting off the darkened windows. Outside, the streets were quiet, as they often were during her night shifts. The clock ticked steadily, marking the slow progression of time. It was a job she had gotten used to, long, uneventful hours punctuated by the occasional emergency. Tonight was supposed to be just another quiet stretch of work. Her hands moved absent-mindedly across the keyboard as she logged the previous shift's reports, keeping one ear tuned to the silence of the office, broken only by the faint hum of electronics and the intermittent crackle of the radio. It was in the midst of this routine, when the first call came in, that the stillness began to unravel. The phone rang, cutting through the quiet with a jarring tone. The caller ID simply read unknown. Marissa picked it up without thinking twice. Prank calls weren't unheard of, though they were rare this late. There was nothing on the other end at first, just static, then a faint sound, like breathing. She repeated her greeting, expecting the caller to either speak or hang up. Instead, the heavy, uneven breathing continued, as if someone was there but unwilling to speak. It lingered for a few seconds before cutting off abruptly. Marissa leaned back in her chair, unsettled by the strangeness of it, but pushed it aside. Calls like this weren't unheard of. Probably a bad line, she thought, brushing it off as she resumed her work. Not 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same unknown number. This time the static was more garbled, as though whatever signal was reaching her was distorted beyond comprehension. Once again, there was no clear response, just the soft exhalation of breath. She listened for a few moments, trying to make sense of it, before the call dropped as suddenly as it had come. It became harder to focus on her tasks after that. Her gaze drifted more frequently to the phone, waiting for the inevitable next ring. And sure enough, it came. The third call. Static, breathing, this time more drawn out. It clung to the edges of her perception, the irregular rhythm of it strange, like someone struggling to keep control. It sent a chill through her. By the fifth call, the strange rhythm had begun to form patterns, distant sounds beneath the crackling interference. Words, barely audible, seemed to form, but were swallowed by the distortion before she could make them out. She listened, more intently this time, her pulse quickening, straining to catch whatever message might be hidden in the noise. The calls began coming in more frequently now, each more garbled and distorted than the last, the static building growing harsher. The breathing, louder, more pronounced, became the constant backdrop to her shift. As the clock inched closer to 3 a.m., Marissa's usual sense of calm gave way to unease. The seventh call came, the line hissing as soon as she picked it up. This time, she could hear something clearer beneath the interference. A whisper, faint and chilling, broke through. Her eyes darted toward the far corners of the room as she listened, the sound twisting in her ears. She tried to make sense of it, but the whispers never fully revealed themselves, fading just as her mind latched onto them. The space around her seemed to grow more distant as the minutes dragged on, the walls of the office feeling far too large for her now. She noticed a subtle change in the room, a cold draft from somewhere, even though the doors were shut and locked. The usual comforting hum of the electronics seemed quieter, less present. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her cup of coffee, which had grown cold, though she couldn't remember it being left untouched for that long. More calls followed, each ringing just minutes after the last. Everyone was the same, static, breathing, faint whispers. Her focus splintered, and her once clear understanding of her environment frayed as the minutes bled into hours. The whispering took on a cadence, almost like a chant, though it was still unintelligible. She replayed each call in her mind, trying to grasp at the hidden message just out of reach. The building was old, and during the quiet of the night, it creaked and groaned with the shifting of unseen weight. Normally, these sounds were background noise, easily ignored, but now, with each call, every noise seemed heightened, each crack of the ceiling more pronounced. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering once or twice, a small annoyance that hadn't bothered her before but now caused her to flinch. The phone rang again. Marissa stared at it for a moment before picking it up, her heart thudding. This time, there was no static, just silence. She listened intently, her ear pressed to the receiver, waiting for the familiar breathing, but there was nothing. Yet the silence felt heavy, as though someone, or something, was listening on the other end. She held her breath, counting the seconds. Then just before the line clicked off, she heard it, a faint, echoing laugh, just under her threshold of hearing. She set the phone down with shaky hands, staring at the screen. The room seemed colder now, Her eyes scanned the office, her mind racing. She wasn't alone. The sense of isolation she had come to accept as part of the night shift had morphed into something far more sinister. The calls were no longer random nuisances. They were targeted, specific, and aimed directly at her. As the clock ticked toward the end of her shift, Marissa's pulse raced. She kept her eyes on the phone, anticipating the next ring, knowing it was only a matter of time. The silence was almost unbearable now, broken only by the occasional clatter of old pipes or the distant thud of something far outside the building. When the final call came, it was different. The static was gone. The line was crystal clear, but still, no one spoke. Marissa didn't move. She didn't speak. She just sat there, listening, waiting for whatever might come next. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the sound of breathing returned, but it was no longer faint. It was right there, close, as though the caller was standing just behind her. Ryan's job as a night security guard in the towering office building was usually monotonous. The building, with its countless floors of deserted offices, sat eerily quiet after hours, long shadows stretching across the polished floors under the dim lighting. He spent most of his shifts staring at surveillance monitors or walking empty hallways, his footsteps echoing in the hollow spaces. The elevator, old and slow, was rarely used after 8 p.m. It creaked and groaned on the best of days, and Ryan had grown used to its quirks. But tonight, that elevator became the focus of his unease. It began while he sat in the control room, his eyes glazing over the security screens. The elevator was moving by itself. There were no scheduled employees working late, and the cleaning crew had left hours ago. Yet there it was, ascending and descending, seemingly at random. The floors it stopped at didn't make any sense either. It would halt at floor 7, linger for a few moments, then travel down to floor 3, pause again, and then inexplicably shoot up to floor 12. This continued for nearly 20 minutes. Ryan rubbed his eyes and stared at the screen. He zoomed in on the elevator's live feed. The doors would open, revealing an empty, dimly lit cabin. Each time it would sit motionless for a few moments before the doors would slowly close again, and the elevator would resume its strange, unsteady path through the building. There was no one inside, no visible malfunction, just a ghostly cycle of random stops. Deciding it must be a technical glitch, Ryan left the control room, flashlight in hand, and made his way toward the central elevators. The building was quiet, more so than usual, with only the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional distant clang of old heating pipes. As he approached the elevator, the doors were just closing, but he hit the button in time, and they slid open for him to enter. The air inside the elevator cabin was cooler than the rest of the building, as if the space hadn't been used for hours, though the cabin had clearly been moving nonstop. He stepped inside and hit the button for the ground floor, intending to ride down and check the system. But the moment the doors closed, the elevator didn't descend. Instead, it began to rise, smoothly at first, then faster, its ascent far quicker than any normal trip he had ever experienced. Ryan looked at the panel. There was no floor number lit up to indicate where the elevator was heading. The building had 20 floors, and yet the numbers on the display were increasing past that, 21, 22, 23. His heart started to pound as the elevator continued its strange climb. He pressed the button for the ground floor again, then for other floors, hoping to stop it. Nothing happened. The cabin felt more confined now, the walls closing in as the display continued to count up. Suddenly, the elevator jerked to a halt. The lights flickered for a moment and the doors slid open with a faint, creaking sound. Ryan stepped cautiously to the threshold, peering into what should have been an office hallway. But what lay beyond the doors was nothing like the sterile, corporate hallways he was used to. Instead, there was a narrow corridor stretching into darkness, the walls lined with peeling, discolored wallpaper that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The faint smell of dampness hung in the air. The floor beneath the elevator was no longer the polished marble of the building's interior, but something uneven, with old, cracked linoleum. He remained in the cabin, his instincts screaming at him not to step out. The hallway stretched on, dimly lit by flickering bulbs that barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead. It didn't match any floor of the building he knew, nor did it seem to belong in any building at all. The space felt wrong, too narrow, too deep. Something about it was out of place, as though it wasn't meant to be there, hidden beneath the familiar structure above. Ryan pressed the close doors button, his pulse quickening. But the doors didn't respond. The hallway remained in front of him, beckoning. He shifted uneasily, stepping back further into the elevator, his eyes locked on the strange passage. The sense that there was something just beyond his sight, lurking in the shadows, grew stronger. The lights in the corridor flickered more rapidly now, casting erratic shadows along the walls. But no movement, no sound reached him from that eerie expanse. When the elevator finally responded, it didn't close the doors right away. Instead, it seemed to hesitate, as though it were waiting for something, an unseen presence, a choice yet to be made. After what felt like an eternity, the doors finally slid shut, enclosing Ryan once more in the tight, cold cabin. The elevator began to descend, slowly this time, the sensation of falling more noticeable than usual. The display panel blinked, but the numbers weren't there anymore, just a blank screen glowing faintly in the darkness. The cabin groaned as it passed each floor, the walls creaking like the old metal was straining under some invisible weight. Ryan's eyes were locked on the doors, half expecting them to open again, revealing some other strange place. But they remained shut. The elevator kept moving, lower and lower, past the basement level, past any floor he had ever known existed. The hum of the machinery grew distant, and all he could hear now was the low, steady hum that surrounded him. Suddenly the elevator came to a stop. The silence that followed was deafening. Ryan didn't move. His breath was shallow as he stared at the doors, dreading what they might reveal this time. After a few long moments, the doors slid open again. He was met with darkness, not the kind of darkness one found in an unlit room, but something deeper, almost like a void. There was no light at all, no indication of where he had landed. He couldn't even see the outline of a hallway or any walls. The blackness was absolute, swallowing everything just beyond the threshold. A cold breeze seemed to drift into the elevator, though he couldn't see its source, and the distant sound of something moving, far off but unmistakable, reached his ears. It wasn't the mechanical clanking of the elevator. It was something else, something shifting in that darkness. His instincts screamed at him to shut the doors, but the controls were unresponsive. He jabbed at the button repeatedly, his hands trembling. The elevator didn't budge. The sound in the darkness grew closer now, a soft rustling that hinted at movement just beyond the edge of his vision. The walls of the elevator creaked under the strain, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the space around him was warping, bending under the weight of whatever lay beyond the doors. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doors slid shut with a metallic thud, sealing him off from the darkness. The elevator jolted back into motion, this time ascending at a breakneck speed. The numbers on the display panel flickered back to life, counting up rapidly. Ryan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but no explanation came. After what felt like hours, the elevator slowed again, coming to a stop. The doors opened to reveal the familiar lobby of the building. Everything was as it should be: the marble floors, the silent reception desk, the faint hum of the overhead lights. It was as though nothing had happened. Yet the lingering sense of dread followed him as he stepped out of the elevator, his mind haunted by the darkness he had seen, or perhaps by what had seen him from within it. Emily had grown accustomed to the late-night shifts in the hospital. The long, winding hallways were mostly empty during those hours, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above. She liked the quiet of it, the steady rhythm of machines in the distance, and the occasional echo of footsteps from other night staff making their rounds. It was a far cry from the chaos of the day shift. The calm was almost comforting, allowing her to focus on the small details of patient care without distraction. But as the night stretched on, something about the hospital began to feel wrong. The stillness of the building no longer seemed peaceful but unnervingly quiet, like the silence before a storm. She was finishing up her rounds on the 5th floor, the most deserted wing of the hospital. It housed long-term patients, most of whom were asleep or sedated by the time her shift started. The lights were dimmer here, casting uneven shadows across the cold, tiled floor. As she checked on the last few patients, she felt a sense of isolation creeping in, as though the walls themselves were watching her. Passing room 509, she noticed the door slightly ajar. It was strange. She was sure she had closed it earlier. The patient in that room, Mr. Granger, was in a coma and had been for months. No one came to visit him anymore. His family had stopped coming long ago, and the nurses rarely entered, except for routine checks. Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the floor, and the faint beep of the heart monitor seemed almost drowned out by the quiet. Mr. Granger lay in his bed as he always did, unmoving beneath the thin sheets. But the curtain beside his bed was drawn, something she didn't remember doing. It wasn't typical for curtains to be drawn unless a procedure or visit was happening, and there had been no scheduled visits that night. She moved closer, instinctively reaching for the curtain. Just as her hand brushed the fabric, she noticed something in the corner of the room, a figure standing in the shadows near the foot of the bed. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, and dressed in what appeared to be a long coat. It stood perfectly still, watching over the comatose patient, as though it had been there for a long time. Emily's immediate thought was that it must be a visitor, though she hadn't seen anyone come in. She hadn't heard the elevator or footsteps approaching. The hospital was locked down at night. Unauthorized visitors couldn't simply walk in unnoticed. Yet here this figure was, standing silently in Mr. Granger's room in the dim light, as though it had every right to be there. She took a step back, her pulse quickening, and glanced toward the hallway. No one else was nearby. The floor was empty save for the sleeping patients and the machines that tended to them. When she looked back at the figure, it hadn't moved. It just stood there, its outline blending into the shadows. There was no sound, no shift in its posture, no indication of its presence other than the fact that it was simply there. Emily didn't move closer. Her instincts urged her to leave, but something about the figure held her attention, like an itch in the back of her mind that she couldn't ignore. She turned and quietly backed out of the room, closing the door behind her. She stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. There was no sound from within. She should have felt relief after leaving the room, but instead, the hallway itself felt emptier, as if the hospital had grown larger, more vast, in the few seconds she had been inside. Returning to the nurse's station, she checked the log. No visitors had signed in that night, and there were no scheduled appointments for Mr. Granger. She briefly considered calling security, but decided against it. There was no immediate threat, just the unsettling presence of a figure where no one should have been. Her next set of rounds took her through different wings, but the image of that figure standing in the corner of the room stayed with her. It felt wrong, out of place, yet strangely familiar, like a memory just beyond her reach. The hospital, usually so sterile and controlled, seemed to take on a different atmosphere as the night progressed. The lights flickered more often, and the sound of the heart monitors, usually rhythmic and soothing, felt dissonant in the quiet. Hours later, as the end of her shift neared, Emily's curiosity got the better of her. She returned to the 5th floor, retracing her steps back to room 509. The hallway was silent, the only sound the faint buzzing of the lights above. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. There was no sign of movement inside, no indication that anyone was still there. But she had to know. Opening the door, she peered inside. The room looked just as it had before, cold, sterile, and quiet. Mr. Granger lay in his bed, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The curtain was still drawn, the same as earlier, and the heart monitor beeped steadily in the background. But the corner where the figure had stood was empty. She stepped further into the room, glancing around. Nothing seemed out of place now, but the chill lingered. Emily turned toward the bed, checking the patient's vitals once more. But as she glanced toward the monitor, her gaze drifted back to the curtain. This time, there was a faint imprint on the floor, as though someone had been standing there for a long time. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A patch of the linoleum floor that looked slightly worn, like something had pressed down upon it for hours. Her eyes widened, and a chill crawled up her spine. The realization that the figure hadn't been a figment of her imagination settled uneasily in her mind. Whatever had been in the room with Mr. Granger had left its mark. She backed out of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she shut the door behind her. For the rest of her shift, Emily couldn't shake the sensation that the hospital was watching her, that the figure, whatever it was still somewhere in the building. The cold, sterile hallways seemed to stretch longer, the distant sounds of machines fading into an eerie hum that followed her wherever she went. When she returned to the nurse's station for the final time that night, she checked the surveillance footage from earlier, hoping to find something that would explain what she had seen. But as she fast-forwarded through the video, the figure never appeared on screen. The door to room 509 opened when she entered, and the room looked empty. just as it always did. No one else came or went. There was no shadow in the corner, no tall figure standing at the foot of the bed. Yet she had seen it, felt its presence lingering long after it should have been gone. Jake worked the night shift at the gas station on the edge of town, where the roads stretched long and empty, barely a car passing by after midnight. It was a lonely job, the fluorescent lights from the station's canopy illuminating the cracked asphalt of the lot and casting long, harsh shadows across the pumps. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional rustle of wind through the bushes by the highway. He had grown accustomed to the solitude. The monotony of it was almost comforting. The few regulars that came in, truckers or late-night travelers, were predictable. They'd buy snacks, maybe cigarettes, fill up their tanks, and be on their way. But on this particular night, as the clock ticked past 2 a.m., the usual routine seemed to shift in an unsettling way. The first sign was the headlights. They appeared on the road far in the distance, cutting through the darkness, approaching slower than usual. Jake watched them for a while, expecting them to pick up speed, but the vehicle crawled along, almost as if it wasn't sure whether to stop or continue. Eventually, the car rolled into the station, pulling up to pump 3. Jake glanced out the window, squinting through the glass, but couldn't make out the driver through the glare of the lights. He waited for the figure to step out, to approach the pump, but minutes passed and no one emerged. The car just sat there, its engine idling, the rumble soft and steady in the otherwise silent night. Unease crept up on him as he peered closer, but from his vantage point behind the counter, the car's windows seemed dark, almost too dark, as though they had been tinted to an unnatural degree. His gaze flicked toward the security cameras. On the small black and white screen, the vehicle appeared hazy, its outlines blurred, almost as if the camera was malfunctioning, though everything else was clear. Finally, the driver's side door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. Jake watched closely, trying to get a good look at the man. He was tall, his posture rigid, and he wore a long coat that seemed to swallow the light around him. His face was hidden in shadow, and despite the brightness of the gas station's canopy lights, the man's features remained obscured, like the darkness clung to him. The man didn't head toward the pump, though. Instead, he stood there, beside the car, motionless for a moment, as though surveying the station. His presence seemed to alter the atmosphere in a subtle way, the hum of the lights overhead almost imperceptibly quieter, the wind outside no longer rustling the trees. Even from inside the station, Jake could sense an unusual stillness in the figure's stance, an unnatural calm. After what felt like an eternity, the man moved toward the store, his steps measured and steady, though there was something disjointed in the way he walked. His shoes barely made a sound on the concrete as he approached the glass doors. Jake stood behind the counter, his hand resting on the edge, watching the stranger draw closer. When the man entered, the automatic doors slid open, but no familiar jingle followed, no usual shuffle of feet against the linoleum floor. It was as if the room itself absorbed his presence. Jake tried to offer a casual nod, but the man didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he walked past the counter without so much as a glance, heading straight for the aisles. Jake's unease deepened as he watched the stranger move through the store. He didn't seem to be looking for anything in particular, just gliding past the shelves, barely glancing at the items on display. There was a stillness to him that felt wrong, as though he wasn't part of the same space, not entirely grounded in the world Jake knew. The security cameras showed the same thing, the figure moving, but in a way that seemed distorted, out of sync with everything else. After a few minutes, the man stopped near the back of the store, where the coolers were. Jake noticed that the usually bright lights above the cooler section seemed dimmer now, casting strange, jagged shadows across the floor. The stranger stood there, his back to Jake, staring at the refrigerators. But he didn't open any of the doors or take anything. He just stood there, motionless once again, like he was waiting for something, or someone. The moments dragged on, and Jake found himself unable to look away. There was something wrong about this whole encounter, something that gnawed at him in a way he couldn't explain. The gas station, usually so sterile and predictable, now felt like a different place altogether, as though the presence of this man had shifted reality in some subtle but terrifying way. Then, without warning, the man turned. His face was still obscured by the shadows, but Jake could see his eyes, or at least he thought he could. Two faint glints of light, reflecting from deep within the shadow that cloaked his features, stared out from where his face should have been. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared, unblinking, fixed directly on Jake. Jake's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. He shifted his weight, fighting the sudden urge to step back, to retreat further behind the counter, but he stayed frozen, locked in place. The stranger, still standing by the coolers, tilted his head slightly as though studying Jake in return. And then, as suddenly as he had arrived, the man moved again, walking back toward the front of the store. His footsteps still made no sound as he approached the door, and once again the automatic doors opened without the usual jingle. Jake watched as the stranger left, his coat sweeping behind him, his form disappearing into the shadows beyond the fluorescent canopy lights. The man didn't return to his car right away. Instead, he stood outside the station for a moment, facing the dark expanse of the highway, as though looking for something beyond the empty road. The car engine still idled quietly, the headlights casting a faint glow on the asphalt. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally returned to his vehicle. He got in, the door closing with a soft click. For a long while, the car just sat there, its engine running, the headlights pointed into the void. Then, without warning, the car slowly pulled away from the pump, its tires barely making a sound on the cracked pavement, and it drifted back onto the empty road, disappearing into the night. Jake stood there for a long time after the car was gone, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The gas station was silent once more, the hum of the refrigerators and the faint buzzing of the lights returning to their usual rhythm. But the space felt changed, subtly altered by the presence of the stranger, like a memory that lingered in the walls and floor. The rest of the night passed in a blur, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, something unseen, watching from the edges of the darkness. When his shift finally ended, and the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Jake left the gas station with an uneasy sense that the stranger hadn't been just another late-night traveler.